Ukraine has to find innovative ways to fight the battle. And that's what they're doing with this incursion. It's militarily, it doesn't actually make a great deal of sense because you're diverting troops away from the main effort. Why would you do that? Politically, it plays to the center of gravity of President Putin. Centers of gravity being things that the one of the combatants just doesn't want to lose. And if Putin knows he's actually put in power by the oligarchs, the power base, if they think there's any chance of this war being lost, they are not currently able to holiday in Paris. They're not able to go across to London. There's all sorts of sanctions crippling their business. And Putin is now indicted by the International Criminal Court. The more that Zelensky can demonstrate to normal Russians that they're in a war, that this isn't just some foreign foray, that actually they are directly being affected, whether it's their young men predominantly and women being returned in boxes or without limbs, whether it's people being evacuated from the Kursk region, 150,000 people, they're going to talk as well. And all the sanctions, I think it all starts to pile up and potentially erode support for Putin.
Well, let's pick up on that. How would you assess the strength of his position domestically currently?
It's a very, very good question, James, and I'm impossibly ill-equipped to answer that. I think what we have seen in history is that dictatorial leaders get very, very swiftly replaced. It doesn't end well generally for dictatorial leaders. I think we saw with Yevgeny Prigozhin, who rode a tide, it felt, of public opinion that managed to get him further to Moscow than many would have expected. Putin will be worried about that. It's very difficult when Putin controls all the information, and largely for domestic Russians, it's a bit like in this country, you might have strong political views, but frankly, as long as it doesn't affect what you do each day, you get up, look after your kids, go down the pub, you don't really mind who's in power. Likewise in Russia, they'll believe whatever they're fed as long as they can get on with their lives, bring up their families in some sort of security. But over time, gradually, the narrative that Putin's coming out with does not connect with the number of people coming back in body bags that they're having to bury. Everybody will know somebody in a body bag. By way of context, in the Afghanistan war in the UK, only a few hundred were killed, several thousand were badly injured. But Help for Heroes created a huge bow wave across the country of sympathy for our servicemen and women. Just imagine multiplying that by 100, maybe 1,000. That's the impact this is having in domestic Russia. So all of this is gradually nibbling away at Putin's power base. When will it crumble? Who knows? But history shows these are often short, sharp shocks rather than through a process of osmosis. But they managed to roll back the Russian defenses pretty quickly. So they capitalized. It now looks likely they have 10,000 troops in that little enclave. It looks like they've blown 3 bridges. If they were planning to go any further, they wouldn't have blown those bridges. So it looks likely they're settling in and digging themselves in. The real surprise is why President Putin doesn't appear to have done anything about it. I think when we discussed before, one of the options was Putin, because he's Mr. Security, he would need to be seen to be dealing with this incursion firmly. I mean, let's be blunt. It's the first time that Russia's been invaded since 1941. So for a man who presents himself as Mr. Security, this is deeply humiliating. So the question is, why has he not reacted so far? And I think what's been interesting, a couple of answers to that. One of them, I come from military where we delegate down. So from our junior non-commissioned ranks, our corporals, our senior non-commissioned ranks, our sergeants, they are empowered to take control in a world of ambiguity. They understand commander's intent. When things happen that are a surprise, they get on and do something about it. Whereas in the Russian military, that's not the way they operate. Any surprises, they look to their boss and say, what do I do now, boss? Their bosses look to their bosses, and it cascades all the way up. In this case, almost certainly to President Putin. And that leads to a sort of strategic paralysis on the front line until the boss, President Putin, decides what to do. I still think there are 2 options, one of which is to crush the Ukrainians that are there. And that would take battle-hardened troops. Russia would have to move them from the front line. That would ease pressure on the front line. And that's exactly what Ukraine is probably hoping it'll do. The other option, which I think is playing out at the moment, is Russia has fixed 10,000 of Ukraine's best fighters in a portion of Russia. He doesn't have to do anything about it now. He can put a ring of steel around it, deal with that another day. Meanwhile, as a military guy, you're always focused on main effort. And what appears to be Russia's main effort is the special military operation, seize Crimea, the land bridge, and the Donbass. He's done most of that. There's a small area of the Donbass, relatively small, he hasn't yet taken. It looks like Putin is doubling down on that. Pokrovsk, Toretsk are the two areas of focus. And that means he's got 10 to 12 weeks this summer before the winter settles in. It becomes much more difficult to fight. And that's what appears to be what Putin is doing at the moment.
And it's interesting as well, he's got his mate Lukashenko in Belarus to assemble some troops on the border with Ukraine in Gomel Oblast of Belarus. So again, that's probably designed to try and divert some Ukrainian troops up there as well?
It could be. I have to say, having been watching this closely for the full scale of the war, you'll recall early on in the war, Russia had positioned troops in Belarus, and there were suggestions that they'd be mounting attacks out of Belarus. And actually using the Belarusian soldiers as part of that attack. The trouble is, Lukashenko is known as the last dictator in Europe. And it was pretty clear at the time that the Belarusian military said, this is not our war. We're not going to follow you in there. And if you do, that would cause all sorts of unrest and potentially lead to the end of Lukashenko. So I suspect Ukraine has discounted that as a serious threat. What Lukashenko is probably trying to do is he wants to be a buddy to President Putin. He wants to demonstrate that he's doing all he can by putting troops at the border. It just puts a little bubble of doubt in President Zelensky's mind. He's probably got to do something with his resources just to cover off that risk, even though it's very unlikely those troops would actually come in.
Do you think, Sean, we will see at some point further cross-border raids by Ukraine into Russia?
I think it's inevitable. I do think that, in fact, I'd be quite surprised if they're not happening already. There's been some articles appeared over the last 48 hours about special operations executives, the name that was given in World War II to areas that were occupied where, resistance fighters operated both within Ukraine, occupied Ukraine, and also in Russia. I suspect there's a continued theme here of making life as unpleasant as possible for Russia. And of course, once Russia realizes that it can't protect its borders, that has strategic. The number one priority of any political master is to protect your people. If you can't do that, real questions start to get asked. Why are we in Ukraine? All of a sudden, more and more people are talking, more and more dissent. That is very difficult for Putin to manage. We're not there yet. I'm not suggesting there's going to be a big coup, but I am suggesting it's just consistently undermining President Putin's position. And that'll be something that I suspect President Zelensky will be doing all he can. It's an asymmetric tactic. It plays to his strengths. I suspect we're going to see more of it.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.